Jasmine Crockett stormed into Fox News like a soldier into enemy fire. Behind the scenes, Kash Patel plotted a live TV ambush, memo and all. Break her on camera. But under the glare of 42 million viewers, it wasn't Crockett who broke, it was Patel. 5 seconds of unflinching silence, a red folder, one sentence that set off a national reckoning. 72 hours later, she hit back with a $90 million lawsuit, $1 for every year Black Americans lived under Jim Crow. What truth did she drop that put Kash Patel's career on the edge? Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. The email arrived just after sunrise, subject line clean and cold. America First Tonight invitation. The Fox News logo sat like a stamp of challenge at the top, and beneath it a single sentence asking her to appear with host Kash Patel. The room was quiet enough to hear the air conditioning click on, then off, like a metronome counting down. Jasmine read it twice, then a third time, eyes narrowing at the politeness that felt rehearsed. A car horn outside snapped, tires hissed, and the city woke up while the offer curled in her inbox like a coiled wire. Her chief of staff stepped in without knocking, phone still in hand, face already tight. "This isn't an interview, this is a media trap," he said, each word low and measured. He paced once past the window, then back, like he was mapping exits in a burning room. "They'll cut your answers. They'll bait you. They want a soundbite they can break you with." He stopped, waiting for her to argue. Jasmine didn't. She set her coffee down and answered as if she'd already decided. "If they want to go for the mind, I will answer with history." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The line landed in the room like a gavel. She knew Kash Patel's style the way a boxer knows a rival's favorite punch. The clipped questions, the easy smirk, the trick of turning facts into traps and traps into headlines. She had watched him goad women of color on air, frame their calm as rage, then sell the moment as proof. That wasn't journalism, that was choreography. He thrived on noise. She planned to bring silence, the kind that makes truth louder. But this time would be different. This time, he wasn't facing a guest to toy with. He was facing a congressional lawyer trained to cut through traps with truth and with the kind of silence that makes an entire room feel the weight of its own noise. While she chose silence as her weapon, the studio chose noise manufactured, weaponized, and timed to detonate on air. Behind a wall of tinted glass, the Fox News production team gathered around a long, glossy table under the sterile glow of overhead lights. Coffee cups were half drained, papers fanned out like blueprints for a siege. The senior producer, a man whose voice cut as clean as the lines on his suit, tapped the schedule with a pen. "We need to take her down, Jasmine is rising, but she's just a shock chaser." His tone was flat, but the weight behind it was clear. This wasn't a conversation about journalism. It was a conversation about demolition. Around the table, heads nodded in rhythm. Pens moved in quick, staccato strokes. Someone circled her name twice in thick red ink, the loops closing in like crosshairs. Another voice leaned in, low but firm. "Keep it tight. Keep it hot. Give the audience a gasp." No one asked what that meant, they all knew. Down a narrow hall lined with coiled cables and silent cameras, Kash Patel stood in front of a cold lens, running through his lines with a precision that bordered on predatory. He didn't pace, he prowled, turning just enough for the imaginary viewer to catch the sharp edge of his smile. "Crime is exploding, what have you actually done?" he fired off, then reset instantly, the smirk reappearing as if on cue. "Open borders, failed immigration, admit it," he snapped, chopping the air with his hand like he was cutting her defense in half before she even spoke. For the final test blow, his voice dropped a notch, tone deceptively calm. "Why won't you condemn Black violence right now?" From the control room, a small audience of producers and camera operators watched through the glass. They timed his pauses, noted the angle of his head, checked that the lower thirds would land exactly as the question did. Every phrase was built as a snare dressed up as concern, designed to leave her cornered. On the side table in the control booth, a fresh sheet of paper slid from a printer and into waiting hands. The memo was only a few sentences, but its bluntness made the air heavier. At the top, in bold, segment, America First Tonight, Crockett. Under it, 2 lines that read like marching orders. Make her lose her cool. Cut the clip at the exact moment. The junior staffer who read it didn't speak, but their brow lifted half warning, half disbelief before the page was tucked into a manila folder and slid shut. The words, though hidden, hung in the room like a smell that wouldn't clear. In the green room, separated from the hum of the control center by 2 thin walls, Jasmine sat alone beneath a muted lamp. The air here was still, carrying only the faint whine of distant studio lights. No phone, no aid, no idle chatter, just her and the red folder resting across her lap. The leather spine was warm under her palm, its weight familiar, its contents sharper than anything they could script against her. She leaned back in the chair, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Footsteps came and went outside quick bursts, fading into quiet again. Somewhere a door clicked shut, sealing the noise away. In this pocket of calm, the red stayed bright, a single vivid mark in a room of neutral tones, as if it were the only thing in the building immune to their plans. The recording began, the studio lights flaring in a blinding wash, erasing the shadows and replacing them with a stage set for confrontation. Kash Patel straightened his posture, the corners of his mouth pulling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His voice, warm only on the surface, carried a calculated edge. Welcome to the show. Tonight we have one of the most controversial figures in Congress today. The pause after controversial was deliberate, a razor left hovering just above the skin. Without giving her room to respond, he leaned in with the kind of speed that made the next line feel like a punch thrown the moment the bell rang. Congresswoman Crockett, people call you a TikTok congresswoman because you spend more time posting online than actually making laws. Acham. The sentence landed with a thud, the sort designed to bruise pride before the conversation even began. Around them, the studio audience reacted on cue, laughter breaking out in uneven waves, some sharp, some smug, all of it meant to reinforce the jab. Kash let the sound play, his expression fixed in the kind of satisfaction a fighter wears after scoring an early point. The overhead cameras pivoted, guided by silent cues from the control room, closing the distance between the lens and her face. In the monitor, her expression filled the frame, no forced smile, no flicker of defensiveness. Jasmine Crockett's eyes were locked on him, steady and unyielding, the stillness in her posture like the moment before a blade is drawn. The audience's laughter began to thin, the echo of it hitting the cold wall of her silence and faltering. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of quiet that demanded the next move come from him, not her. The laughter had barely thinned before Kash leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his voice shifting from mockery to a calculated, prosecutorial edge. You say you're the voice for minority communities, he began, his tone sharp enough to slice through the lights and cameras. But the city you represent has the highest murder rate in the state. The words hung in the air like a charge waiting to strike, and even the audience's movement stilled, eyes bouncing between them. He gave her no breath, no space to redirect. Do you want to blame the system? He pressed, leaning in just slightly as if closing a trap. Or admit that your own community has failed? Jasmine didn't blink, her voice cutting clean through the heat of the moment. Those numbers didn't climb in a vacuum, she said, her tone steady but edged. Our public safety budget was slashed by 40%, youth programs defunded, and community outreach stripped to the bone. You starve a neighborhood of resources? You create the conditions for crime to thrive? This isn't about moral failure, it's about systemic neglect. She leaned in slightly, eyes locked on his, ready to finish the point. But before the last word could land, Kash's voice crashed over hers like a hammer. So you're the victim then? He said, loud enough to force her sentence shut. The interruption deliberate, meant to claim the moment and frame the narrative before she could drive it home. The atmosphere thickened. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to sink to the rising tension. A side camera caught her right hand clamped hard around the edge of the chair, knuckles pale, fingers curled tight, not a sign of defeat, but the physical restraint of someone holding back the next strike until the exact right moment. The tension from the last exchange was still hanging in the air when Kash shifted in his seat, his body language loosening as if to soften what was coming. His tone, however, carried a rehearsed lightness that only made the question feel sharper. Do black people owe this country a little gratitude, he asked, for getting to live in a place like America? It wasn't shouted or spat. It was delivered with the kind of faux innocence meant to disarm. But every syllable was calculated, meant to pierce without appearing to wound. The moment the words left his mouth, the air in the studio seemed to thin. The laughter and murmurs from earlier died completely. For a long beat, nothing moved. The audience stayed frozen in their seats, their attention locked to the space between them. The camera crew, sensing the shift, slowed everything down. One lens pushed tight on Jasmine's face, another drifting toward the control booth where the director sat watching, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Through the pane of glass, that smirk was almost taunting, like someone enjoying a private joke the rest of the room didn't get. The silence grew thick, the kind that forces people to notice it, the kind that turns every second into a decision point. Jasmine didn't break it right away. She let the pause stretch, letting the quiet do its work, letting the weight of the question hang over Kash like a stone suspended by a fraying rope. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, low, and exact. When Jewish people remember the Holocaust, they aren't told to be grateful. When Japanese Americans speak of the internment camps, no one tells them they should feel lucky. But every time we black people speak about our history, we are called complainers. Why is that, Mr. Patel? Why is it only our pain that must come with gratitude? The words didn't rise in volume, but they landed like a gavel, leaving no space for deflection, only the discomfort of the truth she had just laid bare. The sting of her last words was still reverberating through the studio when Kash leaned back, eyes narrowing just enough to signal he was changing tactics. His hand brushed across the desk, aligning a stack of notes he didn't need, buying half a second to sharpen his tone. Then, with a voice that carried the precision of a scalpel, he said, "Do you know your great-grandfather was involved with the Black Panthers? That's an extremist organization." It wasn't shouted. It didn't have to be. The deliberate calmness was meant to make it sound like fact, not accusation, a trick to strip it of emotion while aiming it directly at her credibility. The timing was surgical, as though he'd been waiting for the perfect moment to slip the knife in. A ripple moved through the audience. It wasn't loud enough to break the formality of the set, but it was there, a faint murmur, the sound of people reacting before they realized the cameras might catch them. The control room clocked it immediately. A side camera began its slow creep inward, searching her face for any tell, tightening lips, shifting eyes, even a pause too long. Kash kept still, holding the silence between them like a fisherman letting the hook settle before the pull. But Jasmine didn't bite. She didn't even blink. Her right hand moved with unhurried precision, sliding down to the floor beside her chair, where the red folder rested, its leather spine catching the glare of the studio lights. Her fingers found the latch, flipped it open with a soft, metallic click, and from inside she drew a single document. She didn't glance at it. She didn't need to. She'd chosen this page before she ever stepped into the building. Lifting it onto the table, she spoke with the same steady rhythm she used in court when dismantling a witness. "If we're opening ancestral files, I have your grandfather's file," she said, her voice cool but carrying an undercurrent that was impossible to ignore. She held his gaze as she laid the paper flat, sliding it forward just enough for him to see the header. A real estate broker who refused to sell homes to black families. The paper made contact with the glass tabletop in a muted thud, but in the microphone's range, the sound was amplified by the charged silence that followed. The cameras caught it from two angles, one framing her face calm, composed, almost too still, and the other catching the twitch in Kash's jaw as his eyes darted to the page. The audience's reaction was immediate, though restrained. A breath caught here, a seat creaked there, the small physical tells of people recalibrating what they thought they knew about the man holding the microphone. The hum of the studio equipment seemed louder now, every sound more pronounced in the absence of chatter or laughter. Jasmine didn't rush to press the advantage. She let the moment breathe, as if daring him to speak first. Then, without raising her voice, she delivered the next line like a verdict. "I don't deny the past. I use it to build the future. You sweep yours under the rug." Each sentence landed separately, spaced enough to make the meaning sink in before the next arrived. Her tone wasn't heated, it was deliberate, the kind of control that makes the point impossible to dismiss as emotional flair. She didn't lean forward. She didn't gesture wildly. She simply sat there, her posture straight, her hand still resting lightly on the corner of the red folder, as if to remind him and everyone watching that there was more inside if she chose to take it out. From the control booth, the director's smirk was gone, replaced with a narrowed focus on the monitor feed. He knew this wasn't the exchange they'd scripted for. The entire plan to frame her as flustered, defensive, or overreacting was evaporating in real time, replaced by a picture of a woman calmly turning the table and setting her opponent's family history under the same microscope he'd tried to use on hers. The studio audience, sensing they were in the middle of a shift in momentum, stayed still. No one wanted to miss what came next. The operator on camera 2 held a tight shot on Kash's face, catching the subtle flicker of discomfort behind his practiced expression. The longer the silence stretched, the more it became obvious that Jasmine had taken control of the tempo. The tension from her last words still lingered in the air like static before a storm, and Kash's mask of control finally splintered. His posture, once calculated and contained, leaned forward aggressively, and his voice rose, the edge in it no longer polished, but jagged. "You don't represent Americans," he snapped, each word hitting with the blunt force of a shove. His hand cut through the air, a gesture too sharp to be casual. "You represent the loudmouths who get nothing done." The sentence hung there, jagged and raw, loud enough to make the audience shift in their seats. Some leaned forward, expecting her to bite back. Others froze, watching the studio atmosphere turn electric. The camera crew, sensing the shift, tightened their shots, focusing on every twitch, every flicker of heat in his face. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't even let the insult find purchase. Instead, she moved with deliberate precision, pushing back her chair in one clean motion that cut through the noise. The red folder was already in her hand, its weight an extension of her intent. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the stage floor with a steady rhythm that seemed to count down to impact. When she reached the table, she brought the folder down hard on the glass surface in front of him. The sharp crack reverberated through the studio like a gavel strike, the sound bouncing off the walls and cutting through the shallow buzz of the lights. Kash's eyes flickered down for a fraction of a second, just enough for the cameras to catch the involuntary shift. Her voice came next, not loud, but so precise it felt amplified. "You're not afraid of my voice, Kash," she said, each word deliberate, her gaze locking him in place. "You're afraid of the truth because the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard." She didn't move after delivering it. She didn't have to. The words landed and stayed there, filling the silence, making it heavier with every second. The audience didn't dare breathe too loudly. In the control room, no one spoke. No one blinked. The moment was too sharp to interrupt. Within 12 minutes of broadcast, that single line would be clipped, shared, and ignite like wildfire, circling the globe before the credits even rolled. The sting of her final line was still being replayed across television screens and timelines when the next blow to Fox News landed, and this one came from inside their own walls. Less than a day later, an internal audio recording began circulating online. Its sound grainy but unmistakable. In it, producers and control room staff could be heard in casual, almost gleeful tones, plotting exactly how to take Jasmine Crockett apart on air. "Make her lose her cool," one voice said with a chuckle. Another chimed in, "Cut the clip at the exact moment, make it stick." The laughter that followed was the kind that told you this wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a plan. The leak detonated across the internet. Journalists dissected every second, isolating the voices, transcribing the words, and laying them bare for millions to read. The more people listened, the more obvious it became this wasn't an interview gone wrong. It was an ambush built in the dark, executed under studio lights. Outrage spread quickly, the hashtags multiplying by the hour, and before the day was out, the pressure began to show where it hurt most: the money. One by one, major sponsors issued carefully worded statements, each one colder than the last. They weren't just concerned, they were gone. Contracts dissolved, ad buys canceled, logos stripped from the network's commercial breaks. Boardrooms far from the studio made the calculation instantly. No brand wanted to be tied to a scandal this obvious, this loud. What had begun as a scheme to humiliate Jasmine Crockett had flipped entirely, leaving Fox News in the position of trying to put out a fire they had lit themselves, and finding the flames were already far beyond their control. The shock waves from the sponsor walkout were still shaking the network when her law office stepped in front of the cameras. Reporters crowded shoulder to shoulder on the courthouse steps, microphones jutting forward like bayonets, the air thick with anticipation. The lead attorney unfolded a single sheet of paper and began to read, voice carrying over the din. Jasmine Crockett, it was announced, was filing suit against Kash Patel for defamation, racial prejudice, and an affront to national dignity. The statement didn't just accuse, it documented every contested word from the broadcast, every second of the leaked audio, every frame designed to humiliate was listed, timestamp by timestamp. This wasn't journalism, the attorney declared, pausing long enough for the flashbulbs to pop. It was calculated injury. Then came the figure that made the entire press line stiffen, 90 million. The attorney didn't rush the explanation, letting each syllable land with the weight it deserved. 1 million for each year Black Americans lived under Jim Crow, 90 years written into law, carved into lives, and paid for in blood. It wasn't just a damages claim, it was a ledger of injustice, transformed into a demand for reckoning. The symbolism was searing, the message unmistakable. This lawsuit wasn't about a single night in a studio, it was about history and the cost of trying to weaponize it. Fox News offered no defense, no pushback. Instead, they issued a single, clipped line to the press. We declined to comment at this time. But their actions spoke louder than any statement. By nightfall, every trace of the interview vanished from their official platforms. Video links returned error messages, search results led to blank pages, and where the broadcast once lived, there was only a row of empty thumbnails. It was as if the network was trying to erase the night altogether. But the silence they left behind only made the moment burn hotter in the public memory. The lawsuit cut through the news cycle like a blade, and within days it landed in the echoing chambers of a federal courthouse. The building's marble steps were lined with reporters, cameras fixed on the heavy double doors as though they expected history to walk out at any moment. Inside, the air carried that electric quiet unique to high-stakes hearings, low murmurs from the press pool, the occasional shuffle of papers, and the steady hum of the ceiling fans doing little to ease the tension. Everyone knew the centerpiece of the day's proceedings, and the anticipation hung like storm clouds over the defense table. The court clerk announced, her voice slicing through the low chatter in the gallery. Crockett versus Patel. Crockett's lead attorney rose from the prosecution table with calm precision, buttoning his jacket as he stepped toward the evidence podium. He addressed the judge directly, his tone steady but edged with steel. Your Honor, the plaintiff submits into evidence Exhibit 14, a recording made inside the Fox News control room prior to the broadcast in question. From a slim black case, he withdrew a compact playback device, placing it on the podium as if setting down a loaded weapon. This is Kash Patel, the attorney said, glancing toward the defense table. In his own words, he pressed the button. The speakers filled the courtroom with Patel's unmistakable voice, confident, smug, unguarded. Set her up, he said, the smirk almost tangible in the sound. That girl will walk right into it. A short burst of laughter followed, low and conspiratorial, joined by another male voice in agreement. Chairs creaked, someone chuckled again, and then Patel's voice came once more lighter, almost amused at his own cunning. Trust me, this will be easy. When the clip ended, the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Reporters bent over their notepads, scribbling furiously, while others simply stared, letting the words replay in their minds. On the defense side, Patel shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, one hand curling into a fist against the tabletop. The judge, a dignified African-American man with decades on the bench, leaned forward, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. His voice, when it came, was deliberate and resonant. This is not journalism, he said, each word landing like a gavel. This is manipulation. The statement cut through the room with finality, And outside the courthouse, the political fallout was already accelerating, lawmakers weighing in, sponsors holding closed-door meetings, and network executives scrambling to contain a crisis that now threatened to end Patel's program for good. The judge's declaration, "This is not journalism, this is manipulation," was still echoing through headlines and political talk shows when the walls began closing in. By the next morning, network executives, corporate lawyers, and crisis managers were huddled behind locked boardroom doors. Phone lines burned with calls from advertisers threatening to pull out entirely, legal teams running damage assessments that grew worse by the hour. In the end, the numbers were impossible to ignore, and the decision was made in a single, heavy sentence: settle now or risk losing everything in court. That afternoon, away from the cameras, Kash Patel signed the settlement agreement. His signature scrawled across the final page committed him to two conditions: a $90 million payment to Jasmine Crockett, and a live primetime apology delivered without edits, without spin, and without the safety net of a pre-record. The AMO-PM clause was underlined twice, the ink still wet as the pen left the paper. The air in the conference room felt heavy, the kind of silence that follows a verdict before the gavel falls. Kash didn't speak. The terms spoke for him. When the hour came, the network cut to a stripped-down set, no graphics, no theme music, no co-host to share the weight. Just Kash Patel at the desk, under a single key light, facing the camera that was already live. The red tally light burned steady, the room around him swallowed in shadow. His hands were clasped tight in front of him, knuckles pale, the teleprompter's first line waiting just beyond the lens. The silence before he spoke was so complete, you could hear the faint hiss of the audio feed. He drew in a breath, the microphone catching it. "Good evening. My name is Kash Patel. Tonight I need to say something without spin." His voice was quieter than usual, but stripped of its familiar swagger. "I apologize to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett for defamatory statements, for racial prejudice, and for an affront to national dignity." The words were deliberate, each one weighed before leaving his mouth. He didn't blink as he went on. What aired was not journalism, it was manipulation, planned and executed. The sentence hit like a stone dropped in water, the ripples of admission reaching far beyond the studio. "I accept responsibility for my role in that planning and in that broadcast." His voice steadied, though his jaw stayed tense. "As part of our settlement, I will pay $90 million, and this apology is unconditional, no excuse, no defense." The camera stayed on him for a beat longer after he finished, the silence returning like a held breath. No music faded in, no commercial break cut away. Just the image of a man sitting under the lights, the red tally still burning, the weight of his words hanging in the air for the whole country to judge. The weight of Patel's on-air apology was still settling across the country clips, replaying on every network, headlines dissecting every word when Jasmine Crockett stepped into her own spotlight. This time she wasn't walking into a studio designed to trap her. She was walking into a room she controlled. The press conference was held in the main hall of a historic courthouse, its marble floors polished to a mirror finish, the air thick with the low hum of reporters testing their microphones. Every major outlet was there, shoulder to shoulder, lenses pointed toward a simple wooden podium, draped with a crimson cloth. When she entered, the room shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Camera shutters clicked to life, and all eyes locked onto the figure in the black suit carrying the same red folder that had been her weapon in that Fox News ambush. She didn't rush to the podium. She walked with the same deliberate pace she'd carried onto that studio stage, her heels striking the floor in a rhythm that seemed to set the tempo of the entire room. The sound tech adjusted his levels. The lights followed her to the center. She placed the red folder on the podium, rested her hands on either side, and looked up. "This settlement," she began, her voice steady but amplified with intent, "is not mine to keep." The words landed with weight. Reporters leaned forward, pens hovering above their notebooks. "Every cent of the $90 million will go toward the creation of the Red Folder Fund." She paused, letting the name sink in, letting the symbolism do some of the talking before she continued. Her gaze swept the room, locking onto camera lenses as if she were speaking to people far beyond these four walls. This fund will provide legal defense for women of color targeted by media smear campaigns, she said, because no one should have to fight alone. The sentence hit with the precision of a closing argument, and it was no accident. She had crafted it to be quoted, to be remembered, to be impossible to spin. She reached down, opening the red folder just enough to reveal a stack of neatly organized case files. Names, dates, details. She lifted one page between her fingers, holding it up so the cameras could catch it. Every folder like this, she said, is a story of someone who didn't have the platform to fight back. Women dragged on air without the truth, without a lawyer, without a chance. That ends here. The final 3 words cut through the press hall like a gavel strike. The room was silent except for the mechanical snap of shutters. Even the reporters who had shown up skeptical now found themselves scribbling furiously. Knowing this was no symbolic gesture, it was a declaration of a long war she intended to wage. She leaned forward slightly, her tone tightening. When I carried this folder into that interview, it was my shield. Now it will be theirs. And I want the people who think they can use a camera as a weapon to know there is a cost for that. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the kind that comes when a line lands harder than expected. She didn't let it linger long. The Red Folder Fund will cover legal fees, investigative work, and public advocacy for any woman of color who becomes the target of calculated media defamation. Not just high-profile cases, every case. She said it with finality, like she was setting the rules on day one. If a network thinks it can destroy someone's name for ratings, they're going to have to answer for it with counsel staring back at them in court. Her left hand tapped the folder once, a small gesture, but one that drew every eye back to it. This, she said, is more than paper and ink. This is proof that preparation wins battles. This is proof that they can come for you, but they can't end you, not if you come armed with the truth. The intensity in her voice built, not in volume, but in focus, drawing the press closer without them even realizing they'd leaned in. She glanced toward the back of the room, where several women stood quietly against the wall, community leaders, activists, and a few former clients from her early days as an attorney. I've seen what it looks like when someone walks into a courtroom alone, she continued. I've seen what it costs to fight when you have no resources, no voice, and no one to stand between you and the smear. That's why this fund exists. Not for me, for them, for every one of them. The lights caught the edge of the folder as she closed it with a soft but decisive thud. This money is not a trophy. It's not a payday. It's a weapon, and it's going right back into the fight. There was no applause. This wasn't the kind of speech that needed one. It was the kind that left the room buzzing with the realization that something had just shifted. A reporter near the front broke the silence with the first question. Congresswoman Crockett, why call it the Red Folder Fund? She allowed herself the smallest smile. Because the night they tried to humiliate me on national television, this folder was the only thing in that room they couldn't control. Now it's going to protect a lot more than just me. The cameras kept rolling as she stepped back from the podium, hand on the folder, not in possession, but in promise. In that moment, the settlement stopped being just a number in a court record. It became the seed of something larger, something meant to outlast the headlines and outfight the tactics that had brought them all here in the first place. And as she walked out, the red folder tucked under her arm, every flashbulb seemed to burn just a little brighter, as if trying to capture the exact moment a personal victory became a public cause. The announcement of the Red Folder Fund was still fresh in the public's mind when Houston prepared something that would etch Jasmine Crockett's story into the city's skin. It wasn't just a gesture. It wasn't a plaque on a wall or a ceremonial key to the city that would collect dust in a display case. This was something permanent, something that would stand in the open air, under the sun and the rain, for anyone to see. From the moment the news leaked that the city was commissioning a monument, people began speculating about what it would look like, what moment from her journey it would freeze in time. The answer arrived on a sharp, cloudless morning that seemed scripted for history. The downtown plaza, normally filled with the loose hum of lunchtime crowds, was transformed into a living, breathing audience. Barricades marked the edges, flags lined the steps, and a low stage had been set just in front of a tall shape concealed beneath a heavy red cloth. The fabric shifted lightly in the warm breeze, hinting at the figure beneath. People arrived early, families with children holding handmade signs, lawyers in tailored suits, activists in t-shirts bearing Jasmine's face, and elders who had lived through the eras she spoke about in her speeches. The air was alive with anticipation. Conversations were low and clipped, the way they are before a verdict is read or a game clock runs out. Camera crews jostled for position, their tripods planted like stakes in the ground. News anchors rehearsed their opening lines into handheld microphones, their voices pitched just above the hum of the crowd. Police officers stood at the perimeter, not tense but watchful. This was no protest, no rally. This was something rarer, a city gathering not to demand justice, but to honor the moment when someone had wrestled it back into the light. When Jasmine arrived, the crowd parted in a slow ripple, like a tide drawing back to reveal the shoreline. She wasn't dressed in anything ostentatious, just a tailored black suit, a white blouse, and in her hand, the same red folder that had been at her side during the Fox News interview, during the court hearings, and during the press conference that announced the fund. Its edges were worn now, the leather softened by time and touch, but it still carried the weight of what it represented. She mounted the stage with measured steps, the folder held against her side like it belonged there. No entourage flanked her, no politician stepped up to introduce her. The podium was empty, the microphone silent. This unveiling wasn't about speeches, it was about the thing under the cloth. A city official stepped forward, a hand on the thick rope tied to the top of the covering. He looked at her, waiting for the nod. Jasmine gave it, just once, crisp and without hesitation. The rope pulled taut, the cloth shivered, and then it slid down in one smooth motion, pooling at the statue's base with a soft thud. The first sound was the mechanical crack of camera shutters, rapid and insistent, like a line of dominoes falling. Then came the sharp intake of breath from the crowd. For a moment, no one spoke. The statue stood in dark bronze, taller than life, the figure of Jasmine Crockett captured mid-stride, one foot planted firmly forward, the other just lifting as if she were stepping into the future. Her shoulders were squared, her head held high, her gaze angled slightly upward, not toward the city in front of her, but towards something beyond it, something that could only be reached by moving forward. In her right hand, her fingers curled naturally as if caught in the act of motion. In her left, pressed to her side with unshakable grip, was the red folder. The sculptor had carved it in exacting detail, the subtle grain of the leather, the faint bend in the corner from years of being opened and closed, even the hint of a latch that looked like it might click shut if you touched it. But it wasn't just the physical accuracy that made it powerful. It was the posture, the expression, the way the sculptor had managed to fix in metal the exact quality that had defined her in those tense moments on live television and in the courtroom, a refusal to be moved unless she chose to move herself. Her eyes, bronze though they were, seemed to carry the same unflinching focus that had silenced an entire studio, that had made a judge lean forward in his seat, that had left Kash Patel with no weapon but surrender. At the base of the statue, the pedestal was cut from smooth granite, the color deep enough to drink the sunlight. On the front face, the inscription was carved so deeply you could press your fingers into the grooves. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the truth. The words caught the light, the shadows in their edges, giving them depth and weight. Children moved closer to trace them with their hands, sounding them out in whispers. Parents crouched to explain what they meant. Elderly men and women nodded slowly, the corners of their mouths pulling into small, knowing smiles, the kind that came from having lived long enough to know how rare it was for truth to win so decisively in public view. The plaza itself seemed to hold the moment. The wind moved gently, carrying with it the smell of food trucks parked a block away, but no one turned to leave. People stood rooted in place, as if breaking away too soon might diminish the weight of what they'd just seen. News anchors delivered their live reports with the statue behind them, their voices carrying a tone that was less commentary and more record-keeping. Jasmine didn't speak at first. She stepped closer to the base, her fingers brushing the carved words once, then resting on the cool bronze edge of the folder. The cameras caught it, the woman and the monument of herself, standing together like bookends on a story that still wasn't finished. When she did speak, her voice carried without the help of the microphone. "This doesn't belong to me," she said, her eyes moving over the faces in the crowd. "It belongs to everyone who has been told to sit down, to be quiet, to let someone else tell their story." She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the words to settle. "And it belongs to everyone who refused to do that." She stepped back then. No grand gesture, no final flourish. The statue stood on its own, as it was meant to, its gaze locked on something far beyond the horizon. The red folder, eternal now in bronze, would not close, would not bend, would not be taken away. And for as long as it stood, the people who passed through that plaza would see more than just a likeness of a woman. They would see the moment the voice of one became the truth of many, and the truth once raised could never be lowered again. The bronze statue still drew crowds, everyday tourists posing at its base, locals pausing on their way to work, school groups gathering in front of it as teachers explained what it stood for when Jasmine stepped onto another stage. This one wasn't carved in stone or cast in metal. It was lit by spotlights, flanked by black curtains, and filled with the quiet expectancy of hundreds of people packed shoulder to shoulder in a downtown theater. Outside, the night was warm, the hum of the city low and steady, but inside the air was charged, the kind of tension that builds before a moment you know will leave a mark. She walked out without fanfare, no introduction beyond her own name. The applause was immediate, heavy, rolling over the stage like a wave. She didn't wave back or gesture for them to quiet, she simply waited, letting it crest and fall naturally until the only sound left was the rustle of bodies settling into their seats. The red folder, the same one that had been her weapon and her shield, was on the lectern in front of her, closed but unmistakable. She laid a hand on it as if grounding herself before she began. Her voice carried with the kind of clarity that didn't need amplification. "Freedom is not something that is given to you," she said, each word struck clean, as if hammered into place. "It's something you have to take back one sentence, one line, one courtroom at a time." The way she said it made it clear she wasn't speaking in metaphor. She meant every syllable literally. The audience was still, heads tilted slightly forward, the way people lean in when they're afraid to miss a word. She paced once across the stage, slow, deliberate. "I've seen what happens when we wait for it to be handed over. I've seen what happens when we assume the truth will defend itself. It won't. It never has. If you want it to stand, you have to stand with it. And standing with it means doing the work, finding the facts, speaking them out loud, and refusing to sit down when someone tells you to." Her tone wasn't loud, but it had the same weight as a closing argument, the kind that doesn't ask for agreement so much as it demands acknowledgement. She paused, her hand drifting back to the folder. "This," she said, giving it a small tap, "isn't just paper and ink. It's the record of what happened when someone tried to write me into their story without my consent. And it's the proof of what happens when you take that pen back." A murmur ran through the crowd, the recognition of a truth they'd seen play out in headlines but never distilled so sharply. Jasmine's eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on faces in the front row, students with notepads, activists with lanyards, older women with arms folded, like they'd come ready to measure her words against their own hard-earned wisdom. "Our story doesn't end with a win in court or a check with a lot of zeros," she said. "It doesn't end with a statue or a headline. Those things are moments, not endings. The real story begins when you understand this. The people who control the narrative," she paused, letting the air tighten, "are responsible for it. And when they fail that responsibility, it's on us to take it back." The applause came, but it wasn't the kind that bursts up all at once. It built slowly, starting in pockets and spreading until it was the only sound in the room. She didn't smile, not fully. She let them have the moment, but she didn't let them mistake it for the point. When it eased, she stepped forward again, her voice sharpening just enough to cut through the lingering claps. "Responsibility," she said, "isn't comfortable. It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to keep you awake at night. It's supposed to make you think twice before you speak, and 3 times before you decide someone else's truth doesn't matter as much as your version of it. We have too many people in positions of power who think the microphone is a weapon they can aim however they want. But a microphone, like a camera, like a headline, isn't supposed to be a weapon. It's supposed to be a witness. And if it's not being a witness, then it's a tool for manipulation. And that is not free speech, that is control. There was no mistaking the shift in the room. People straightened in their seats, some leaning forward, others jotting notes as if afraid the phrasing might slip from memory. She took another slow step along the stage, her heels quiet against the wood. When they tell you your voice is too loud, what they mean is your truth is too close. When they tell you to calm down, they mean they're running out of room to move without bumping into the facts. And when they try to write your story for you, don't edit it. Don't negotiate it. Take the pen back. She turned slightly, the red folder catching the stage lights, the shadow of it stretching long across the floor. That's what I did. Not because I wanted to make a point, not because I thought I could win, but because I knew I couldn't let someone else's lie become the record. She let that hang there, the silence stretching like the moments on live TV when a truth lands harder than anyone expected. Then softer, but no less direct, she added, "Don't wait for the next person to stand up. Don't assume someone else will be the one to pull the curtain back. If the story is yours, the fight is yours." Her gaze swept the crowd one last time, landing briefly on a young woman in the back row who hadn't taken her eyes off the stage since Jasmine began. She closed by stepping back to the lectern, resting both hands on the red folder. "Freedom," she said again, "is not something that is given to you. It's something you have to take back one sentence, one line, one courtroom at a time. And the fight doesn't stop when you win. It stops when those who control the story understand they are accountable for every word of it." The lights above seemed hotter now, the air heavier. The applause this time was immediate, loud and unbroken. But Jasmine didn't move to leave. She stood there for a moment longer, letting them see her not as the statue in the plaza, not as the headline, but as the person who had lived every inch of what she was telling them. And when she finally stepped away, the sound followed her, not just the clapping, but the low, resonant understanding that the story wasn't over, and the responsibility to tell it right was now in the hands of everyone listening. The applause from Jasmine's speech still echoed in the minds of those who heard it, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded, humming with the weight of what she had left unsaid. It was the kind of silence that forces people to face themselves, to think about where they stand when the lights go out and the stage is gone. Outside the theater, the city was moving, as it always did, cars honking, lights flashing, strangers passing without meeting eyes. But for those who had been inside, the world felt sharper now, the edges more defined. They had heard the story. Now came the question of what it meant, not just for her, but for them. And it was here, in that unsteady quiet, that the real message of her fight began to take shape. She had not fought just for her own name, that much was clear. The courtroom battles, the long nights poring over transcripts, the endless hours in rooms where every word was dissected and turned against her, none of it was done for a plaque or a headline. It was done because the truth, once surrendered, doesn't come back on its own. "If you give away the pen," she had said once in an interview, "don't be surprised when the story isn't yours anymore." And as simple as it sounded, it was the hardest thing for most people to do, to keep hold of that pen, to keep writing when the whole world told you to stop. That was the pulse of her message. Hold on. It wasn't just about legal victories or moral high ground. It was about the daily grind of integrity, saying the thing you're not supposed to say, asking the question they don't want you to ask, standing where they'd rather you not stand. These acts aren't glamorous, and they rarely make headlines, but they build the backbone that every community needs. Jasmine's story wasn't one of sudden heroism. It was a story of persistence, of showing up even when the outcome was uncertain, even when the cost was high. And if there was one thing she wanted people to understand, it was that courage doesn't look like a movie scene, it looks like consistency. The deeper truth she left behind was this: systems don't fix themselves. They don't wake up one day and decide to be fair. If they bend, it's because someone is pushing against them. And if they break, it's because enough hands refuse to let go. In her case, that push had been for her own defense, but the ripple was much bigger. Every person who saw her fight understood that the same tools used to silence her could be turned on anyone. The names would change, the circumstances would shift, But the core struggle, the one between control and accountability, would always be the same. That was why her words felt less like a conclusion and more like a warning. "Don't wait for someone else to fight your fight," she had said as the final lines of her speech. "Because by the time they do, it might not be your fight anymore. It might be theirs, and you might be on the other side of it." Those lines didn't just apply to politics or courtrooms. They were a map for survival in a world where the truth is constantly up for auction. If you didn't protect it, someone would buy it, twist it, and sell it back to you in a version you didn't recognize. And maybe the most unsettling part was how easily that could happen without anyone noticing until it was too late. Her message also carried a responsibility that people couldn't ignore once they heard it. The fight isn't over when you win. It's over when you stop paying attention. History is filled with victories that were celebrated in the moment and then eroded over time because no one stayed to guard them. Jasmine's battle was a reminder that freedom is less like a gift and more like a garden. It has to be tended, protected, and sometimes defended from those who think it belongs to them. And if you walk away, weeds grow fast. What made her story different wasn't just that she stood her ground, it was that she did it without turning it into a performance. She didn't need to shout to make herself heard. She didn't need to humiliate anyone to prove her point. She used the same tools they tried to weaponize against her: facts, documents, the very rules they claimed to uphold, and she made them answer to those rules in front of everyone. It was the most dangerous kind of resistance, the kind they couldn't dismiss without exposing themselves. And maybe that was the most powerful lesson: silence is not always surrender, and speaking is not always shouting. Jasmine had taught them that the delivery matters as much as the message, that a calm, unwavering voice can cut through a room faster than a raised one if the truth behind it is sharp enough. She had shown that composure can be a weapon, and restraint can be a strategy, and that dignity, once claimed, is nearly impossible to take away. For those who had followed her journey, the transformation wasn't just in the outcome, it was in themselves. They saw her stand in rooms designed to intimidate, and instead of shrinking, she filled them. They saw her take blows meant to break her and turn them into leverage. And they saw her walk away without bitterness, carrying only the truth and the certainty that it had been worth it. That was the example she set. Not to be unshakable all the time, but to keep moving forward even when you are shaken. The real impact of her message would not be measured in court rulings or op-eds. It would be measured in the quiet choices people made when no one was watching, choosing to speak up in a meeting, refusing to sign off on something wrong, asking the uncomfortable question. Those small acts, multiplied across communities, were what kept the line from slipping. Jasmine's fight was proof that one person could hold that line long enough for others to grab it too. And that, more than anything, was how the tide turns. By the time the crowd filtered out of the theater that night, many walked differently, not faster, not slower, but with a weight in their step that wasn't there before. They knew the story now. They understood the stakes. And whether they liked it or not, they had been given a choice: to be part of the push or to let someone else decide how their story would be told. In that way, Jasmine's victory was never hers alone. It was an invitation, and like all real invitations, it came with the unspoken truth that if you ignore it, you can't complain about what happens next. The weight of Jasmine's words didn't just linger in the room. They followed people out the door, clinging to their thoughts like an echo that refused to fade. It wasn't the kind of speech you simply applaud and forget. It was the kind that demands a response, the kind that leaves you staring at your own reflection later that night, asking yourself where you stand. Her story had drawn the battle lines, but they weren't between parties, states, or ideologies. They were between those willing to act and those content to watch. And she had made it painfully clear: watching is not neutral. Watching is surrender. She hadn't fought all those battles so people could treat her story like a movie they'd seen once and moved on from. She fought so people would see the cracks in the system and know they had the power and the duty to push back. That's why her voice had that edge, why every pause was loaded with the unspoken challenge: what will you do now? Because if her fight stayed her fight alone, then everything she endured would mean nothing. If the audience walked away unchanged, the silence would be louder than any applause she'd received. And this wasn't about politics. It wasn't about wearing the right button or sharing the right article. It was about choices, small, daily, personal choices that stack up over time until they define who we are. Saying no when it's easier to say yes, standing with someone when it costs you something, calling out a lie even when the liar outranks you. These weren't abstract ideas. They were steps anyone could take right now, in the world as it is. Jasmine's fight was proof that one voice can tilt the balance, but it's the chorus that changes the song. Don't wait for permission, she had told them once. No one's going to hand you the moment you have to take it. That line wasn't just for the people in power. It was for the ones sitting at kitchen tables, the ones scrolling in the dark, the ones telling themselves they'll speak up next time. The truth is, there's never a perfect time. There's just now. And now is where the system either shifts or hardens, depending on whether we choose to lean in or back away. The urgency in her call wasn't for effect, it came from experience. She had seen how quickly doors close when you hesitate, how fast narratives get rewritten when you don't defend them in the moment. The same tools they use to box her in silence, delay, distraction are the ones they'll use on anyone. And the only real defense is to refuse to play by those rules. Speak, act, refuse to be erased. These aren't dramatic gestures reserved for leaders. They're survival habits for anyone who wants to live in a world where truth still matters. That's why her closing message hits so hard. If you want the truth to stand, you have to stand with it. Not tomorrow, not when it's safe, now. It wasn't about heroics, it was about ownership. If you let someone else carry your truth, don't be surprised when it's not your truth anymore. If you hand over the fight, don't expect them to fight for you. Jasmine had made her choice in front of the entire nation, and she was daring every person listening to make theirs. Because the reality is, injustice doesn't always announce itself with sirens. Sometimes it comes quietly, dressed in procedure and paperwork, smiling as it tightens the grip. You don't feel the walls moving until the space around you is too small to stand. That's why you have to act before you're cornered. That's why you have to pay attention before it's personal. And that's why her words carried the weight of both warning and invitation, because every day you stay silent is a day you teach the system that you'll accept it. The choice she laid before them was simple, but it wasn't easy. Step in or step aside. Be part of the push or be part of the wall. She didn't need to tell them which side history would remember, because deep down, they already knew. And if there's one thing history has proven, it's that change doesn't come from comfort. It comes from the moment enough people decide discomfort is worth it. Jasmine had reached that moment long ago. Now she was asking without flinching, who would meet her there? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.